Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Three in the morning. It's always 3 in the morning when I wake up hearing those sounds again. My new house is over 1,000 miles from Olympic National Park, but still, I still hear them. My wife says they're just nightmares. She wasn't there. She didn't see what I saw that October night in 2016. Vermont winters are harsh, but they're clean, predictable. The cold here bites your face and numbs your fingers, but it doesn't whisper your name. The forests around our house are young, second-growth maple and birch that rustle with normal sounds. Back in Washington, the Olympic Peninsula held trees that had been growing since before Christ walked the earth. Sitka spruce and western red cedars so massive you could drive a truck through their hollowed trunks. The temperate rainforest there creates a different kind of darkness. Ancient, thick, alive with moisture and secrets that seep into your bones. I need to tell someone this. My therapist says I should write it down, but writing feels too permanent, too real. Maybe speaking it will help me sleep through the night for once. Maybe someone else needs to know what can happen out there, in those deep places where civilization has never truly taken hold. My name is Cale Thornfield. I was 26 when it happened, had been working as a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for just over 18 months. Young, eager, convinced my training manual had prepared me for anything the wilderness could throw at me. I was wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. The Pacific Northwest in October is something else entirely. The Olympic Peninsula gets over 12 feet of rain a year, and by mid-autumn everything is saturated. The forest floor becomes a spongy carpet of decomposing leaves that muffle every footstep. Fog rolls in from the Pacific like clockwork, turning familiar trails into alien landscapes. Darkness falls by 5 p.m., and when you're 30 miles deep in old-growth forest, that darkness is absolute. No city glow on the horizon, no ambient light pollution. Just black so thick you can feel it pressing against your face. I thought I knew what I was dealing with. Wildlife, weather, the occasional lost hiker. My supervisor, Ranger Marcus Webb, had 23 years of experience and always said the forest would teach you everything you needed to know if you listened carefully enough. What he never mentioned was that sometimes the forest teaches you things you wish you'd never learned. October 15, 2016. That's when Thalia disappeared. She was a graduate student from the University of Washington, working on her doctoral dissertation about mycorrhizal networks in old-growth ecosystems. 24 years old, serious about her research, experienced enough in fieldwork that her advisor felt comfortable letting her work alone for extended periods. She'd been studying a particular grove of ancient Douglas firs about 8 miles off the Hoh River Trail, documenting the underground fungal connections between trees that were already centuries old when Lewis and Clark first mapped the Oregon Territory. Thalia had checked in via satellite phone on October 13th, reporting normal conditions and requesting an extension of her research permit. She was supposed to check in again on the 15th. When she didn't, her research advisor contacted the Park Service. Standard protocol for overdue researchers. We'd done dozens of these searches. Most of the time, people just got absorbed in their work and forgot to call in, or their equipment malfunctioned, or they decided to hike out a day early without updating anyone. I volunteered to lead the initial search. I was young, motivated, and frankly, eager to prove myself capable of handling something more challenging than directing tourists to the nearest restroom. Webb paired me with Ranger Patricia Moss, a 15-year veteran who knew the Hoh River area better than anyone. We were supposed to be a routine 2-person search team, equipped for a maximum 48 hours in the field. We started before dawn on October 16th, following the Hoh River Trail to Thalia's last known research site. The autumn air was crisp, but not yet winter cold, heavy with the smell of decomposing cedar and the ozone scent that comes before rain. Our breath misted in the early morning light filtering through the canopy, 200 feet above our heads. Everything seemed normal, routine even. Patricia was quiet for the first few miles, which wasn't unusual. She was one of those rangers who believed in listening to the forest, picking up on subtle changes that might indicate problems ahead. Around mile 4, she stopped suddenly. "You hear that?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. I listened. The usual forest sounds, dripping water from the canopy, occasional bird calls, the distant rush of the Ho River. "Hear what?" "That's just it," she said. "Listen again." I did. And then I understood. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no small mammals rustling through the underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted. It was as if every living thing in a wide radius had decided to hold its breath. "Probably nothing," Patricia said, but I caught the slight edge in her voice. "Sometimes storms make animals go quiet. Weather Service said there might be a front moving in tonight." We continued hiking, but the silence followed us. Our footsteps on the soggy trail seemed unnaturally loud, and I found myself unconsciously moderating my breathing. The fog was starting to roll in earlier than usual, creating pockets of reduced visibility that made familiar landmarks disappear and reappear like ghosts. Thalia's research site was located in a grove of ancient Douglas firs and western red cedars, some of them over 800 years old and nearly 20 feet in diameter. She'd established a small base camp with a lightweight tent, research equipment, and sample containers. When we arrived around noon, everything appeared undisturbed. Her tent was properly secured, equipment neatly organized, no signs of struggle or panic. But Thalia was gone. Patricia began documenting the scene while I started a preliminary search of the immediate area. Standard protocol called for expanding circles, looking for any indication of which direction the missing person might have traveled. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, dropped items, anything that might provide a trail to follow. That's when I found the first anomaly. Thalia's research focused on mycorrhizal networks, the underground fungal connections between trees that allow them to share nutrients and chemical signals. She'd been carefully excavating small sections of forest floor to expose and photograph these fungal networks. Her excavation sites were precisely marked with surveyor's flags and GPS coordinates, each one documenting a specific connection point between trees. But scattered throughout the grove, I found additional excavation sites, crude, hurried digging that had disturbed the carefully mapped fungal networks. Someone else had been digging here, and recently. The disturbed soil was still dark with moisture, not yet dried by exposure to air. "Patricia," I called. "You need to see this." She joined me at the largest of the unauthorized dig sites, a rough hole about 3 feet deep and 5 feet across. The excavation had exposed not just fungal networks, but what appeared to be much older organic material. Fragments of wood that looked almost fossilized, and something else. Small white objects that made my stomach clench when I realized what they were. Bone fragments. Old ones, but definitely bone. "Jesus," Patricia whispered. This wasn't Thalia's work. I was already reaching for my radio to contact headquarters when Patricia grabbed my wrist. Her face had gone pale, and she was staring at something behind me. I turned around and felt my blood freeze. Carved into the bark of the massive Douglas fir that anchored Thalia's research site was a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked fresh. The inner bark was still weeping sap, but the design itself seemed ancient. Intersecting lines that formed a pattern that hurt to look at directly, as if my eyes wanted to slide away from it rather than focus. "We need to call this in immediately," Patricia said. "This isn't a simple missing person case anymore." I was already dialing headquarters on my radio when the static started. Not the normal interference you get in dense forest, but something else. Rhythmic pulses of white noise that almost sounded like breathing. Heavy, labored breathing coming through the speaker. "Base, this is Thornfield," I said into the microphone. "We have a situation at the Crane research site. Request immediate backup and possibly police involvement." Static. Then, impossibly, a voice came through the radio. A child's voice, high and sweet and absolutely wrong in every way that mattered. "Cale," the voice said, "we've been waiting for you." Patricia's hand was gripping my shoulder so tightly I could feel her fingernails through my jacket. The radio crackled again, and this time the child's voice was joined by others. Multiple children, singing something that might have been a lullaby if it hadn't been in a language I'd never heard before. I switched the radio off, but the singing continued for another 10 seconds before fading to silence. "Equipment malfunction," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to myself. "Atmospheric interference can cause radios to pick up strange signals." Patricia nodded, but her eyes were scanning the forest around us with the alertness of someone who just realized they were being hunted. We decided to expand our search pattern while trying to re-establish radio contact with headquarters. The fog was getting thicker, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet in any direction. The massive trees loomed out of the mist like cathedral pillars, their tops disappearing into gray-white nothingness above our heads. I was following what appeared to be a game trail leading away from Thalia's camp when I found her backpack. It was hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground, suspended by its straps like someone had carefully placed it there for maximum visibility. The pack was undamaged, still containing Thalia's research notes, water bottles, and emergency supplies. But inside the main compartment, mixed in with her field notebooks, were things that didn't belong. Photographs, dozens of them, all showing the same grove where we were standing, but taken at different times. Some were obviously recent. I could see Thalia's tent and equipment in the background. But others were older, showing the same trees but with different people working among them, people dressed in clothing that looked decades out of date. The oldest photograph was black and white, showing a group of men in early 20th century work clothes standing around what appeared to be an excavation site. The same excavation site where we'd found the bone fragments. But it was the most recent photograph that made my hands shake. It showed me and Patricia, taken from somewhere above us, just moments before. We were standing exactly where we stood now, examining Thalia's backpack. In the background, barely visible through the fog, was a figure watching us from behind one of the massive cedar trees. I spun around, scanning the forest, but saw nothing except shifting fog and ancient bark. "Patricia," I called, "we need to get out of here. Now." She emerged from the fog about 15 feet away, moving quickly toward me. But as she got closer, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. She was walking backward. Her face was turned toward me, expression normal, mouth moving as if she was speaking, but she was walking backward through the forest with perfect confidence, never stumbling over the uneven ground or bumping into trees. I blinked hard, shook my head, looked again. Patricia was walking normally toward me, no longer backward, looking concerned. "You okay?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed at the expression, but nothing about our situation was funny anymore. "We're leaving," I told her. "Right now. Something is very wrong here." We packed up quickly and started back toward the main trail. The fog continued to thicken, and I found myself using my compass more frequently to maintain our bearing. The problem was, the compass needle kept drifting, not spinning wildly like you might expect from magnetic interference, but slowly rotating as if it was trying to point to something other than magnetic north. Halfway back to the main trail, we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere ahead of us, in the direction we were traveling. A woman's voice, high and terrified, crying for help. It sounded like Thalia. Patricia and I looked at each other. Every instinct I had as a rescue professional told me to run toward that scream, to find the person in distress and render aid. But every primitive survival instinct I possessed was telling me to run in the opposite direction as fast as possible. The scream came again, closer this time, and definitely Thalia's voice. She was calling my name. "How does she know your name?" Patricia whispered. I didn't have an answer for that. We moved toward the sound, but carefully, checking our surroundings constantly. The fog was so thick now that we could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The massive trees emerged from the gray like monuments to something vast and patient, and utterly indifferent to human concerns. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse. Crying. Soft, heartbroken sobbing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not just Thalia now, but multiple voices. Women, children, men. all crying in harmony, a chorus of grief that made my throat tight and my eyes water. "This isn't natural," Patricia said. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands shaking as she adjusted her radio. "Whatever's happening here, it's not natural." I was about to respond when I saw movement in my peripheral vision, a figure standing motionless behind one of the enormous cedar trees, just at the edge of visibility through the fog. I turned my head to look directly at it, and it vanished. "Did you see that?" I asked Patricia. "See what?" I pointed toward the tree where the figure had been standing. Someone was watching us from behind that cedar. Patricia looked where I was pointing, then back at me with an expression of growing concern. "Cale, there's nobody there, and that's not a cedar. That's a Douglas fir." I looked again. She was right. It was clearly a Douglas fir, its distinctive bark pattern unmistakable, but I would have sworn it was a cedar just moments before. The crying sounds were getting louder, and now I could distinguish individual voices within the chorus. A young woman who might have been Thalia, an elderly man speaking in what sounded like a Native American language. Children, so many children, their voices high and sweet and absolutely heartbreaking. "We need to get back to the main trail," I said. "Something is playing games with us." But when we tried to retrace our steps, the forest had changed. I know how that sounds. Forests don't change. Trees don't move. Trails don't relocate themselves. Compass directions remain constant. But I'm telling you what happened. Not what should have happened according to the laws of physics and rational thought. The game trail we'd been following was gone. The landmarks I'd been using for navigation, a distinctive boulder, a dead snag with a particular pattern of woodpecker holes, had vanished as if they'd never existed. Even our own footprints in the soft forest floor had disappeared, leaving no trace that we'd ever passed that way. Patricia was trying her radio again, getting nothing but static punctuated by those rhythmic breathing sounds. The breathing was getting heavier, more labored, as if whatever was producing it was getting excited. "Base, this is Ranger Moss," she said into her microphone. "Emergency situation at Hoh River Research Site. Request immediate backup and medical evacuation capability." The radio crackled and then a voice came through. Patricia's voice, speaking her exact words back to her but with subtle differences. The tone was slightly off, the inflection wrong, as if someone was mimicking her speech patterns without quite understanding their meaning. "Base, this is Ranger Moss. Emergency situation at Hoh River Research Site. Request immediate backup and medical evacuation capability." Patricia stared at the radio in her hand, then looked at me with an expression of pure terror. The forest around us had gone completely silent again. No dripping water, no wind in the canopy, no distant river sounds. Just absolute unnatural quiet that seemed to press against our eardrums like physical weight. That's when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling us in the fog, always just beyond the range of visibility. Not the quick, light steps of forest animals, but the measured pace of something large and bipedal that was taking its time, studying us, deciding what to do with us. I drew my service weapon, a Glock 22 that I'd qualified with but never fired outside of a shooting range. The weight of it in my hand was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it gave me something to do with my hands, terrifying because I was starting to suspect that whatever we were dealing with might not be stopped by bullets. "Stay close," I whispered to Patricia. "Whatever happens, don't let the fog separate us." The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, Patricia's shallow breathing, and something else. A sound that took me several seconds to identify because it was so completely out of place. Music. Faint and distant, but definitely music. An old song, something that might have been popular in the 1940s or 1950s, playing on what sounded like a scratchy gramophone record. The music was coming from deeper in the forest, from the direction opposite to where we wanted to go. But as we listened, the melody began to change, becoming distorted and slowing down like a record player running out of power. The cheerful big band sound became something ominous and wrong, the instruments producing notes that hurt to listen to. We follow our original bearing, I said. Ignore everything else. Focus on getting back to the main trail. But as we started walking, the forest began to actively resist our progress. Branches that had been clear moments before suddenly hung at head height, forcing us to duck or change direction. Roots that hadn't been there before appeared underfoot, creating perfect opportunities to trip and fall. The ground itself seemed to shift and slope, making every step uncertain. And through it all, the sensation of being watched continued to intensify. Not just watched, studied, evaluated. Something was observing our every move with the patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run. The fog began to take on shapes, vague human forms that would solidify just enough to be recognizable before dissolving back into gray mist. I saw what might have been Thalia reaching out to me, her mouth open as if she was screaming, but no sound emerged. I saw children holding hands in a circle, dancing around one of the massive trees, their faces turned upward toward something in the canopy that I couldn't see. Most disturbing of all, I saw myself. Multiple versions of myself at different ages, all watching me with expressions of disappointment and accusation. A younger me, fresh out of ranger training, shaking his head in disgust at my cowardice. An older me, gray-haired and scarred, mouthing words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. You should have known better. Kyle, Patricia said urgently, look at this. She was standing next to a tree I hadn't noticed before, a western red cedar that was significantly smaller than the ancient giants surrounding it. Carved into its bark, about chest high, was something that made my stomach lurch. A message, carved in block letters with what looked like a knife or hatchet. Cale Thornfield, Forest Ranger, died October 16th, 2016. He should have listened. Below the inscription was a date, today's date, and what appeared to be GPS coordinates. That's not possible, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to myself. Patricia was already entering the coordinates into her GPS unit. The device beeped, displaying our exact current location. Someone's playing psychological games with us, she said, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. Someone who knows who we are and what we're doing here. The music had stopped, replaced by something worse. Whispering voices, dozens of them, speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The whispers seemed to come from the trees themselves, from the moss-covered ground, from the fog that surrounded us like a living thing. And underneath the whispers, almost below the threshold of hearing, was a sound that made my skin crawl. Digging. Someone or something was digging somewhere nearby. The rhythmic scrape of metal against earth punctuated by the occasional thud of displaced soil. We're getting out of here right now, I said, grabbing Patricia's arm. Emergency protocols. We move fast, we move together, and we don't stop for anything. But as we started to run through the fog, something ran with us. I could hear it pacing us, staying just outside of visual range but matching our speed perfectly. When we slowed, it slowed. When we sped up, it sped up. But it wasn't trying to catch us. It was hurting us, pushing us in a specific direction through subtle changes in the sounds it made. We burst out of the fog into a small clearing I'd never seen before, despite having hiked this area dozens of times. In the center of the clearing was a structure that shouldn't have existed. A crude lean-to built from cedar boughs and camouflaged with moss and ferns. It was expertly constructed, nearly invisible until you were close enough to touch it. And sitting in front of the lean-to, as if he'd been waiting for us, was a man. He was maybe 45 years old, lean and weathered, with the kind of deep tan that comes from spending years outdoors. His hair was long and unkempt, streaked with premature gray, and his clothes were military surplus gear that had seen hard use. But it was his eyes that made me instinctively tighten my grip on my weapon. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much and enjoyed every minute of it. Rangers, he said, standing up slowly with his hands visible. Been expecting you. Name's Vernon Hask, formerly Staff Sergeant, 75th Ranger Regiment. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan before I decided the real war was right here at home. Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them, I said, drawing my weapon but keeping it lowered. We're conducting a search for a missing person. Have you seen a young woman mid-20s carrying scientific equipment? Vernon smiled, and the expression transformed his face into something predatory. Oh, I've seen her all right. Sweet little Thalia. She's been keeping me company for the past couple of days. We've had some real interesting conversations about her research. Patricia had her radio out, trying once again to contact headquarters. This time she got through, but the transmission was broken and barely audible through heavy static. In pursuit of suspect. Coordinates. Request immediate backup. Vernon tilted his head, listening to the radio transmission with apparent amusement. You know, he said conversationally, radio communications can be tricky out here. Lot of natural interference, magnetic anomalies, atmospheric pressure changes, that sort of thing. Sometimes messages get through, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get modified. As he spoke, I became aware that the forest around us was too quiet again. Not the pregnant silence we'd experienced earlier, but the complete absence of sound that comes when every living thing in the area has fled or hidden. "Where is Thalia Crane?" I asked, raising my weapon to a ready position. "She's safe," Vernon said. "For now. But see, she stumbled onto something she shouldn't have. This whole area, it's got history that goes back a lot further than your Park Service maps indicate. Native burial grounds, sacred sites, places where the boundaries between our world and other places get a little thin." He gestured toward the ancient trees surrounding us. The Quinault tribe used to consider this grove forbidden territory. They had stories about voices that called to people from the forest, about travelers who disappeared and were found years later, if they were found at all. Of course, most folks these days don't put much stock in old Indian legends. Vernon's smile widened. But I've been living out here for almost 2 years now, and I've learned to appreciate the local folklore. See, there's power in these old places, power you can use if you know how to ask for it properly. The spirits here, they don't much care for trespassers, but they respect someone who shows proper reverence. I was trying to process what he was saying, while simultaneously scanning the area for escape routes and additional threats. The clearing felt like a trap, surrounded by dense forest with limited visibility. If Vernon had partners, they could be anywhere. "The symbols you've been carving," Patricia said suddenly. "You're the one who's been disturbing the research sites." "Disturbing?" Vernon laughed, a sound that made my teeth ache. "Lady, I've been communing. Those old burial sites, they're not just holes in the ground, they're doorways, gateways to places where the normal rules don't apply." He reached into his jacket, moving slowly and deliberately. I tensed, ready to fire, but he only pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "I've been documenting everything," he said, flipping through pages covered with sketches and handwritten notes. "The symbols, the voices, the way time moves differently in certain spots. Your missing grad student, she was documenting fungal networks, but she stumbled onto something much more interesting. A network of power that runs through this entire forest, connecting not just trees, but connecting our world to others." Patricia was backing away slowly, trying to put distance between herself and Vernon while keeping her radio ready. I could see her finger hovering over the emergency beacon that would broadcast our GPS coordinates to search and rescue teams. "Don't do that," Vernon said without looking at her. "The spirits don't like electronic interference, makes them agitated." As if summoned by his words, the whispers started again. Dozens of voices speaking in languages that predated European settlement of the Pacific Northwest. But mixed in with the native voices were others, English speakers from different time periods, people who had apparently disappeared in these woods over the decades and whose voices had somehow become part of the ambient sound. I heard a woman singing a lullaby in what sounded like 1940s English, a man calling for help in an accent that suggested he was from the early 1900s. Children laughing and playing games in languages I didn't recognize. And underneath it all, barely audible, Thalia's voice calling my name. "She's alive," I said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Define alive," Vernon replied. "She's conscious, if that's what you mean, but she's also been selected. The spirits have taken an interest in her research. They want to show her things, teach her things that weren't in any of her textbooks." The temperature around us began to drop noticeably, not the gradual cooling that comes with evening in the forest, but a sudden, localized cold that made our breath visible in the space of seconds. The fog began to thicken again, and I could see shapes moving within it, tall, thin figures that might have been human if humans could walk through solid trees without effort. "You're going to take us to her," I said, keeping my weapon trained on Vernon's center mass. "Right now." "Am I?" Vernon asked, genuinely curious. "See, that's where things get complicated, Ranger Thornfield. The spirits have been telling me about you, about why you're really here. They say you're not just looking for a missing person. They say you're looking for answers to questions you don't even know you're asking yet." Patricia's emergency beacon activated with a piercing electronic shriek that cut through the supernatural whispers like a knife. For a moment, the forest fell completely silent, as if every entity, living, dead, or something in between, was holding its breath. Then the screaming started. Not human screaming. Something else. Something that conveyed rage and violation and a hunger that had been growing for centuries. The sound seemed to come from the trees themselves, from the earth beneath our feet, from the very air around us. Vernon's expression shifted from predatory amusement to genuine alarm. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. "They really don't like to be interrupted." The fog began to swirl around us in patterns that defied the wind direction. The temperature continued to drop until I could feel ice crystals forming in my nostrils with each breath. And the shapes in the fog were getting clearer, more defined, more unmistakably not human. I saw something that might have been a man if men were 8 feet tall, with arms that reached to their knees. I saw a woman whose face was beautiful from the front but appeared to be hollow from the side, as if she were only two-dimensional. I saw children holding hands in a circle, but their shadows fell upward instead of down, reaching towards something in the canopy that I couldn't see but could feel watching us. "Where is Thalia Crane?" I shouted over the inhuman screaming that was getting louder by the second. Vernon pointed toward the largest of the ancient Douglas firs, a giant that must have been growing when the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. "She's learning," he said. "Learning about the network that connects everything in this forest. Learning about the price of knowledge." I looked where he was pointing and saw something that made my sanity take another significant hit. The tree was hollow. Not naturally hollow, but carved out, creating a space inside the massive trunk that glowed with a sickly phosphorescent light. And suspended in that space, wrapped in what looked like fungal filaments that pulsed with their own dim illumination, was Thalia. She was alive. I could see her chest rising and falling, but she was completely motionless. Her eyes were open but rolled back, showing only the whites. The fungal filaments extended from her body into the tree itself, creating a connection that looked disturbingly organic, as if she was being slowly absorbed into the ancient wood. "Jesus Christ," Patricia whispered. "What did you do to her?" "I didn't do anything," Vernon said. "This place did it. This place has been hungry for a long time, hungry for someone who could understand the connections, who could become part of the network permanently." I started toward the tree, but Vernon held up a hand. "I wouldn't recommend that," he said. "The protective circle isn't complete yet. If you interrupt the process now, she dies, and probably takes half the forest with her." The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that was somehow worse. Breathing. Deep, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the entire forest had developed lungs. "You have 2 choices," Vernon continued. "You can try to take her by force, in which case the spirits will add you to their collection, or you can leave, walk away. Tell your supervisors that you found no trace of her, that she probably fell into the river and was washed out to sea." Patricia was frantically working her radio, trying to raise headquarters, but the static had returned with a vengeance. Occasionally, fragments of voices would break through, dispatch operators, other rangers, search and rescue coordinators, but the transmissions were garbled and incomplete. I looked at Thalia suspended in the hollow tree, connected to something ancient and hungry by filaments that pulsed with each of her heartbeats. She was alive, but was she still human? And if I tried to cut her free, would I be saving her, or condemning her to something worse? The shapes in the fog were getting closer. I could see details now that I wished I couldn't. Faces that had once been human but had been changed by years or decades of exposure to whatever power flowed through this forest. Bodies that moved wrong, as if the bones inside had been rearranged for purposes that had nothing to do with normal locomotion. And I could hear more voices now, dozens of them, speaking my name. Some were pleading, some were threatening, some were singing lullabies that made my skin crawl, but all of them knew who I was, knew why I was there, and seemed to know things about my past and future that I didn't know myself. "The choice isn't really yours anyway," Vernon said, reading my expression. "The spirits have already decided. They've been waiting for someone like you for a long time. Young, inexperienced, full of certainty about how the world works. They find that kind of confidence nourishing." That's when I realized that the entire situation had been orchestrated from the beginning. Vernon hadn't just stumbled onto this place and decided to make himself at home. He'd been recruited, chosen, groomed for his role as a liaison between the human world and whatever ancient intelligence inhabited this forest. Thalia hadn't randomly selected this grove for her research. She'd been guided here, drawn by subtle influences that she'd interpreted as scientific curiosity, and I hadn't volunteered for this search assignment. I'd been manipulated into volunteering. My eagerness to prove myself expertly played by forces that understood human psychology better than I understood it myself. "You're all part of it," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "The Park Service, the university, the research programs. You're all feeding people to this thing." Vernon's smile was infinitely sad. "Not feeding," he said. "Offering. There's a difference. The spirits here don't take by force. They wait for people to come to them willingly, drawn by curiosity, by ambition, by the need to understand things that are beyond human comprehension." The breathing sounds were getting louder, more labored, as if whatever was producing them was getting excited. The fungal filaments connecting Thalia to the tree began to pulse faster, and I could see her body beginning to change. Her skin was taking on a bark-like texture, and her hair was darkening to the deep brown of rich forest soil. Patricia grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here," she said. "Right now. Call for backup. Get a full search team. Come back with equipment and reinforcements." But even as she spoke, I could see doubt in her eyes. What backup could possibly help us deal with something like this? What equipment could cut through fungal filaments that connected to the root system of trees that had been growing for 800 years? Vernon was watching our exchange with interest. "You're thinking like humans," he said. "Linear problem-solving technological solutions, the cavalry riding to the rescue. But this isn't a human problem. This is older than your entire civilization, older than the concept of rescue." The fog was beginning to thin, but instead of revealing the familiar forest I knew, it was showing me something else entirely. The same grove, the same ancient trees, but from different time periods. I could see Native Americans conducting ceremonies around fires that burned without wood. I could see early European explorers disappearing into tree trunks that opened like doors. I could see decades of missing persons, all of them eventually finding their way to this same place, drawn by the same inexorable pull that had brought us here. And in every vision, in every time period, there was someone like Vernon, a guardian, a facilitator, someone who had been chosen to help maintain the balance between worlds. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Time works differently in places like this," Vernon replied. "Sometimes it feels like I arrived yesterday. Sometimes it feels like I've been here since the trees were saplings. The spirits help you adjust your perspective." Patricia was backing toward what she hoped was the edge of the clearing, but the fog was moving with her, maintaining the same distance, keeping us trapped in this pocket of impossible space. "Kyle," she whispered urgently. "My GPS is showing that we're moving. We're not walking, but our coordinates keep changing. We're going deeper into the forest even though we're standing still." I looked at my own GPS unit and felt my stomach drop. She was right. According to the satellite readings, we were traveling at a steady 5 miles per hour in a direction that didn't exist on any map. Southeast by south-southeast into terrain that the topographical surveys showed as impassable rocky cliffs. The boundaries are flexible here, Vernon explained, as if he could read my confusion. Space, time, the laws of physics, they're more like guidelines than absolute rules. The spirits can fold reality when they need to, create pockets where different rules apply. The breathing sounds were coming from multiple directions now, surrounding us completely. I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck, but when I turned around, there was nothing there except more fog and the vague shapes of trees that might or might not have been real. Thalia made a sound. Not quite a moan, not quite a word, but something that might have been my name. Her eyes were still rolled back, but her lips were moving, and the fungal filaments connecting her to the tree were pulsing in rhythm with her speech. I moved closer to the hollow tree despite Vernon's warnings. The phosphorescent glow was stronger up close, and I could see that the interior of the tree was far larger than should have been physically possible. The hollow space extended both up and down beyond what my flashlight could illuminate, creating a vertical tunnel that seemed to stretch from the roots to the crown of the ancient Douglas fir, and the walls of the tunnel were covered with symbols. Not carved symbols like the ones we'd found at Thalia's research site, but symbols that appeared to be growing out of the wood itself. They were constantly shifting, changing, rearranging themselves in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Occasionally I would catch glimpses of recognizable shapes, human figures, animals, geometric patterns, but they would transform into something else before I could focus on them properly. "She's becoming part of the network," Vernon said from behind me. "The mycelial connections, the ones she was studying, they're not just between trees. They connect everything. Every plant, every animal, every person who's ever died in this forest. She'll be able to see it all, understand it all, but she won't be human anymore." I reached toward the fungal filaments, thinking I might be able to cut them with my knife, but Vernon grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," he said. "Look closer." I followed his gaze and saw something that made my hand freeze inches from Thalia's suspended form. The filaments weren't just connected to her skin, they were growing out of her, emerging from her pores, from her fingernails, from the corners of her eyes. They weren't restraining her, they were part of her now. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The transformation? About 36 hours. But the real question is, how long has she been chosen? How long have the spirits been calling to her, influencing her research, guiding her toward this moment?" Patricia's radio suddenly burst to life with clear, static-free communication. All units, this is base. We have multiple teams converging on your last known coordinates. ETA 15 minutes. Acknowledge." I reached for my radio, but Vernon shook his head. "They're not coming to rescue you," he said. "They're coming to contain the situation. Your Park Service has protocols for this kind of incident, protocols that prioritize secrecy over human life." "You're lying," Patricia said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Vernon pulled out his leather notebook again and showed us a page covered with official-looking documents, incident reports, missing person files, internal memos, all bearing the letterhead of the National Park Service. 17 people have disappeared in this area over the past 20 years, he said. Hikers, researchers, even other rangers. Every investigation concludes the same thing. No evidence of foul play, presumed accidental death, case closed. But the bodies are never found because the bodies don't exist anymore. They become part of something larger. The radio crackled again. "Thornfield Moss, if you can hear this, you need to evacuate the area immediately. We have a hazmat situation developing. Chemical contamination from an illegal dump site. Evacuate now and proceed to decontamination staging area at mile marker 7. "Hazmat situation?" Patricia looked at me with growing alarm. "There's no chemical contamination here." Vernon's laugh was bitter. "Standard cover story. Chemical spill, gas leak, unexploded ordnance from military training exercises. Anything that gives them legal authority to seal off the area and keep civilians away. By tomorrow morning, this entire grove will be behind locked gates with warning signs about toxic soil contamination." The shapes in the fog were becoming more aggressive, reaching toward us with appendages that might have been arms if arms could stretch like taffy and bend in directions that violated basic anatomy. I could hear whispers in languages that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly into my brain. And through it all, Thalia continued to change. Her transformation was accelerating, the fungal filaments multiplying and spreading across her skin like living tattoos. But her eyes had rolled forward again, and she was looking directly at me with an expression of profound sadness. "Help," she whispered, the word emerging from lips that were already taking on the texture of bark. "Please help me." That broke something inside me. Whatever Vernon was saying about protocols and networks and ancient spirits, there was still a human being trapped in that tree. A young woman who had come here to study fungal connections and had instead become one herself. I drew my knife and lunged toward the filaments connecting Thalia to the tree. The forest exploded into chaos. The whispers became screams, the breathing became howling wind, and the temperature dropped so fast that ice began forming on every surface. The fog swirled into a vortex around the hollow tree, and I could see shapes materializing within it. Faces that had once been human, reaching toward me with expressions of hunger and desperate need. Vernon was shouting something, but his words were lost in the supernatural storm that was building around us. Patricia was firing her weapon at something I couldn't see, the muzzle flashes illuminating nightmare scenes for brief instants before darkness swallowed them again. My knife connected with the first fungal filament and it parted like overcooked spaghetti. But instead of freeing Thalia, the cut caused her to convulse violently, and black fluid began pouring from the severed connection. Not blood. Something else. Something that smelled like centuries of decomposition and tasted like copper when it splashed onto my lips. "Stop." Vernon was suddenly beside me, grabbing my knife hand. "You're killing her. The connections aren't restraints, they're life support. Cut them all and she dies." I looked at Thalia's face. Her eyes were wide with pain, and the bark-like texture of her skin was spreading faster now, as if my intervention had accelerated the transformation rather than stopping it. "Then how do we save her?" I demanded. "You don't," Vernon said sadly. "You can't. The process has gone too far, but you can choose how it ends. Quick and merciful, or slow and agonizing." The radio burst to life again, but this time the voice wasn't from park headquarters. "Kyle." It was Thalia's voice, but it was coming from the radio speaker, not from her mouth. "Kyle, can you hear me?" I grabbed the radio. "Thalia, yes, I can hear you. We're going to get you out of there." "No," her voice said through the static. "You're not. But you need to understand something. This isn't evil. It's not good either, but it's not evil. It's just older, bigger, and it's been waiting so long for someone who could help it connect to the modern world." Patricia was beside me now, her weapon trained on Vernon, but her attention focused on the radio. "The fungal networks I was studying," Thalia's voice continued. "They're not just biological. They're a communication system, a way for the consciousness of the forest to share information across time and space. But they need interpreters, people who can bridge the gap between human understanding and something much more complex." "We can find another way," I said desperately. "We can bring in specialists, scientists who understand this better than we do." "The specialists already know," Thalia replied. "Some of them. The ones who've been feeding information to researchers for years, guiding them towards specific discoveries, specific locations. This isn't an accident, Kale. This is recruitment." The fog around us was beginning to take on a different quality. Instead of the gray-white mist that had surrounded us earlier, it was becoming luminescent, shot through with threads of blue and green light that pulsed in patterns that almost looked like writing. "Your Park Service knows," Vernon said quietly. "Some of them, anyway. The ones with high enough clearance. They've been facilitating this for decades, providing researchers and suitable candidates for integration. In exchange, they get warnings about natural disasters, information about geological changes, insights that help them manage the wilderness more effectively." I thought about my supervisor, Marcus Webb, and his 23 years of experience. How many searches had he sent junior rangers on? How many missing person cases had he personally overseen? And how many of those cases had ended with the same conclusion? No evidence of foul play, presumed accidental death, case closed. You're saying the Park Service is complicit in murder, Patricia said. Not murder, Vernon corrected. Evolution. The spirits here aren't killing people. They're offering them something, a chance to become part of something larger, something that has been growing and learning for thousands of years. Most people refuse, consciously or unconsciously. They fight the process and they die. But some, like Thalia, embrace it. Through the radio, Thalia's voice came again, but it was different now. Layered, harmonized, as if multiple versions of her were speaking simultaneously. I can see everything, she said. Every tree in the forest, every animal, every person who has ever walked these trails. I can feel the mountain breathing, the rivers thinking, the sky dreaming. It's beautiful, Kale. Terrifying, but beautiful. The luminescent fog was forming shapes now, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, but conveyed meaning nonetheless. I could see the forest from above, a vast network of interconnected life that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the national park. I could see the underground fungal connections that Thalia had been studying, but also something else. Streams of consciousness flowing between the trees, carrying information and memory, and something that might have been love. The choice is yours, Vernon said. Both of you. You can try to leave, report what you've seen, let your superiors deal with the consequences. Some people do that. They usually don't make it very far before they have accidents, car crashes, hiking mishaps, medical emergencies that can't be explained by conventional medicine. Patricia lowered her weapon. You're saying we don't actually have a choice. You always have a choice, Vernon replied. But choices have consequences. The spirits here don't force anyone to stay, but they also don't allow anyone to leave who might threaten the secrecy of this place. I looked at Thalia, suspended in the hollow tree with fungal filaments spreading across her skin like living circuitry. Her eyes met mine, and I could see something that might have been her original personality still looking out from behind the transformation. What happens if we stay? I asked. You become part of the network, Vernon said. Gradually, painlessly, you retain your consciousness, your memories, your personality. But you also become connected to something much larger. You can still leave the forest, still interact with the outside world, but you'll always be connected to this place. And if we refuse? Vernon's expression was genuinely sympathetic. The accidents I mentioned. Sometimes they happen quickly, sometimes they take years, but they always happen eventually. The radio crackled one more time, and now I could hear multiple voices speaking through it. Thalia, but also others. Previous researchers, missing hikers, people who had disappeared in these woods over the decades. All of them speaking in harmony, sharing the same message. It's not death, they said. It's transformation. And once you understand what you're becoming part of, you won't want to go back. I looked at Patricia. Her face was pale, but her expression was thoughtful rather than terrified. The professional part of her brain was still working, still trying to find a solution to an impossible problem. How long do we have to decide? She asked. Until the backup teams arrive, Vernon said. Once they get here, the containment protocols kick in. Anyone in the contamination zone gets classified as a potential security risk. You'll be debriefed, sworn to secrecy, and monitored for the rest of your lives. And accidents happen to people under monitoring just as easily as they happen to people who try to expose the truth. The breathing sounds had faded, replaced by something that might have been singing. Multiple voices harmonizing in languages that predated human speech, creating melodies that resonated in my bones and made my teeth ache with their beauty. I could see lights through the fog now, flashlight beams moving in our direction. The backup teams were getting close. 10 minutes, Vernon said, checking his watch. Maybe 15. Then the choice gets made for you. I walked closer to the hollow tree, close enough to touch Thalia's suspended form. The fungal filaments were warm under my fingers, pulsing with life and purpose. And when I touched them, I could feel what she was feeling. The vast, interconnected consciousness of the forest flowing through her awareness, like a river of liquid starlight. Is there pain? I asked her. Not pain. Her voice came through the radio. Change, growth, the same discomfort a butterfly might feel as it breaks out of its chrysalis. But Kale, I can see things. I can see what's coming. Climate change, species extinction, the collapse of ecosystems that have existed for millions of years. And I can see how to prevent it, how to heal it. But only from here. Only as part of this. Patricia was standing beside me now, her hand resting on my shoulder. If we do this, she said quietly. If we accept whatever this is, do we lose ourselves completely? Vernon shook his head. Look at me. I've been part of the network for 2 years, and I'm still Vernon Hask. Still remember my military service, still remember my life before this place. The difference is that now I also remember things that happened here before I was born, and I can feel the forest breathing around me like a living thing. The flashlight beams were getting brighter. I could hear voices now, calling our names, official radio traffic coordinating the search. They'll find the clearing empty, Vernon said. No signs of struggle, no evidence of what happened here. Just another mystery for the files. But you'll still be here, just changed. I looked at Patricia, trying to read her expression in the phosphorescent glow emanating from the hollow tree. What do you think? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, listening to the harmonized voices singing through the radio static. I think, she said finally, that I became a park ranger because I wanted to protect wild places. If this is what protecting them really means. She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. We both understood. The forest around us was holding its breath, waiting for our decision. The ancient trees leaned in like giants, listening to children whisper secrets. The fog formed patterns that looked almost like words in languages that had never been written down. And through it all, Thalia watched us with eyes that held both human compassion and something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. I made my choice. I reached out and touched one of the fungal filaments connecting her to the tree. It was warm, alive, pulsing with information that flowed directly into my nervous system. Images flooded my mind, the forest as it had been centuries ago, as it was now, as it could be in the future if the right choices were made. I saw myself walking the trails of Olympic National Park, still wearing a ranger uniform, still helping visitors and protecting wildlife. But I also saw myself understanding things that no training manual had ever covered, sensing changes in weather patterns days before they developed, knowing which trails would be safe and which would be dangerous, feeling the health of the ecosystem like a doctor feeling a patient's pulse. Patricia's hand joined mine on the filament, and I felt her consciousness merge with the network. For a moment, all three of us, Patricia, Thalia, and myself, were one mind experiencing the forest from the perspective of something that had been alive since before humans existed. It was terrifying and beautiful and absolutely right. The flashlight beam swept through the clearing 5 minutes later, but by then there was nothing to find. Just an empty space in the forest where 3 park rangers had briefly existed as separate entities before choosing to become part of something larger. The official report stated that Rangers Moss and Thornfield had conducted a thorough search of the area, but found no trace of the missing researcher. Presumed accidental death, case closed. Both rangers were commended for their dedication and professionalism under difficult circumstances. But if you know what to look for, if you understand the signs, you can still find us in the Olympic forest. We walk the trails in the early morning and late evening, when the boundary between worlds is thinnest. We help lost hikers find their way back to safety, and we guide researchers toward discoveries that will help them understand the true nature of the wilderness they're studying. And sometimes, when someone ventures too deep into the ancient groves, when they stumble onto knowledge that could change the world or threaten the delicate balance between human civilization and something much older, we give them the same choice we were given. Most people choose to leave, to forget what they've seen, to return to their normal lives with nothing more than a vague sense that they've missed something important. But a few, the ones who understand what they're being offered, choose to stay. The network grows stronger with each new addition. The forest becomes more aware, more capable of protecting itself against the threats that face all wild places in an industrialized world. And somewhere in the hollow of an ancient Douglas fir, Thalia continues her research. documenting connections that exist far beyond anything she could have imagined when she was merely human. I still wake up at 3 in the morning sometimes, but not from nightmares. I wake up because that's when the forest dreams most clearly, and the dreams are so beautiful that my human consciousness can barely contain them. My wife in Vermont thinks I'm talking in my sleep, but I'm not talking to her. I'm talking to the trees. The official records show that I transferred to a different park district 6 months after the crane incident, citing personal reasons and a desire for a change of scenery. But transfer records can be altered, and memories can be adjusted, and sometimes the most important truths are the ones that never make it into any official file. If you're ever hiking alone in the deep wilderness in those places where cell phones don't work and GPS signals get confused, listen carefully to the sounds around you. If you hear children singing lullabies in languages you don't recognize, if you see symbols carved into tree bark that hurt to look at directly, if you feel like something vast and patient is watching you with ancient eyes, you've found one of the thin places. And if you're brave enough, if you're ready to become part of something that has been growing for thousands of years, just stand still and wait. Someone will come to explain your options. Someone who used to be a park ranger, or a researcher, or just a hiker who stumbled onto knowledge that changed everything they thought they knew about the world. Someone like me. Because the network is always growing, always learning, always looking for people who can help bridge the gap between human understanding and something much larger. And once you become part of it, once you feel the forest breathing around you like a living thing, you'll understand why some choices aren't really choices at all. They're just the next step in an evolution that started long before humans existed and will continue long after we're gone. The forest remembers everything, and now so do I. Three in the morning. It's always 3 in the morning when I wake up hearing those sounds again. My new house is over 1,000 miles from Olympic National Park, but still, I still hear them. My wife says they're just nightmares. She wasn't there. She didn't see what I saw that October night. My name is Tobias Merrick, and I need to tell someone this story. It's been 9 years since I left my job as a forest ranger and moved from Washington to Nevada. 9 years since I traded the perpetual mist and ancient Douglas firs for desert scrub and endless sun. People ask why I made such a drastic change, why I left a job I loved in one of the most beautiful places on earth for this barren landscape. I tell them I needed a change of scenery. I don't tell them the truth, that I can't stand the sound of wind through trees anymore, or that the sight of fog makes my hands shake. I worked as a ranger at Olympic National Park for 8 years before the Delilah crane case. 8 years of search and rescues, wildlife management, and helping lost hikers find their way back to safety. I thought I knew every danger that forest held: hypothermia, falling trees, aggressive elk during rutting season, people who wandered off marked trails and got turned around in the maze of old-growth timber. I was wrong. Completely wrong. There are things in those woods that don't belong in any training manual. The call came in on October 15, 2016, around 4 p.m. The autumn light was already starting to fade. That's one thing about the Pacific Northwest that people don't realize. By October, darkness starts creeping in by 5, and in a forest that dense it comes even earlier. Under that canopy of 200-foot cedars and firs, twilight can feel like midnight. Delilah Crane, 16 years old, had been reported missing by her parents when she failed to return from what was supposed to be a day hike. She was a senior at Roosevelt High in Seattle, an honor student working on a photography project documenting old-growth forests. Her parents said she'd driven up alone that morning, planning to hike the Hoh River Trail to photograph some of the ancient trees for her environmental science class. What made it unusual was that Delilah wasn't some unprepared city kid. Her father had been taking her camping since she was little. She knew the basics: stay on marked trails, carry the 10 essentials, let someone know your planned route and return time. She'd done everything right, which made her disappearance more concerning. I was assigned as lead on the search, working with 2 other rangers, Marcus Webb and Janet Kowalski. Marcus was approaching retirement, a 25-year veteran who'd seen everything the park could throw at him. Janet was newer, About 3 years on the job, but competent and thorough. We made a good team. The first thing we did was check Delilah's car, still parked at the Hoh River trailhead. Her parents had given us a list of what she'd been carrying. Canon EOS camera with extra batteries, water bottles, trail mix, rain jacket, emergency whistle, and a small first aid kit. Standard day hike gear for someone who knew what they were doing. Inside the car, we found something that immediately caught my attention. Her cell phone plugged into the car charger. Most kids her age are practically surgically attached to their phones, but she'd left it behind intentionally. Smart, actually. Cell service in the Hoh rainforest is non-existent, and the battery would just drain searching for signal. We started our search at the trailhead, following standard protocol. The Hoh River Trail is well maintained and clearly marked for the first several miles, winding through some of the most spectacular temperate rainforest in the world. Massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks tower overhead, draped in moss that hangs like tattered curtains. The sound is distinctive, a constant dripping from the canopy above, the distant rush of the river, and an underlying silence that seems to absorb everything else. For the first 2 hours, everything was routine. We found her footprints in the soft earth at several points, confirmed by the tread pattern on her hiking boots that her parents had described. The prints were clear and purposeful, staying on the main trail. About 3 miles in, near where the trail splits toward the Hoh River bridges, we found our first real clue. Her camera lens cap, sitting in the middle of the trail. Janet bagged it as evidence while Marcus and I examined the area. The lens cap wasn't scuffed or damaged. It looked like it had been deliberately placed there, not dropped. Around that spot, Delilah's boot prints became less distinct, mixing with other footprints. Larger prints. Size 11 or 12 boots with aggressive lug soles, the kind worn by serious hikers or military personnel. Could be another hiker who helped her, Janet suggested. But something about those prints bothered me. They were too deliberate, too careful. Most people walking the trail left scattered prints, varying their pace and stride length. These were methodical, staying to the edges of the trail where the ground was firmer. We radioed our position back to headquarters and continued following both sets of tracks. About a quarter mile further, they diverged from the main trail, heading north into unmarked forest. This was where things started to feel wrong. I've spent thousands of hours in that forest, and you develop an instinct about these things. The woods have rhythms, bird calls, insect sounds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. As we followed those tracks into the thick timber, those sounds began to fade, not all at once, but gradually, like someone slowly turning down the volume on the forest itself. Marcus noticed it too. He stopped and tilted his head, listening. "Quiet," he said. And it was. Unnaturally quiet. Even the constant dripping from the moss seemed muted. The tracks led us deeper into old-growth territory, where the trees were massive and the canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. Ferns and moss carpeted everything, and fallen logs the size of small houses created a maze of natural obstacles. It's beautiful, but also disorienting. Without clear sight lines, it's easy to lose your sense of direction. About half a mile off trail, we found her camera. It was sitting on a fallen log, perfectly positioned, as if someone had carefully placed it there for us to find. The camera body showed no damage, and when I checked, it still had battery power. But when I scrolled through the photos, my stomach dropped. The last dozen shots were all taken after she'd left the main trail. Early photos showed the typical scenic shots you'd expect. Towering trees, shafts of sunlight filtering through the canopy, close-ups of moss and ferns. But the later photos were different. They showed the same locations from different angles, as if she'd been circling back on herself. And in several of the shots, barely visible in the background shadows, there were shapes that didn't look natural. "Look at this." I called Marcus and Janet over, showing them the camera's LCD screen. In one photo, a dark silhouette stood between two large trees about 50 yards behind, where Delilah had been photographing a particularly massive cedar. The shape was tall and lean, clearly human, but there was something off about the proportions. The arms seemed too long, or maybe it was just a trick of shadows and perspective. Janet squinted at the screen. "Could be another hiker." Could be, I agreed, but I didn't believe it. The figure wasn't moving like someone just walking through the forest. It was positioned as if watching, waiting. And in the next photo, taken just minutes later based on the timestamp, it was gone. We continued following the tracks, but they were becoming harder to read. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, and the October rains had made everything soft and muddy. What concerned me more was that we were now finding only one set of clear prints, the heavy boots. Delilah's lighter footprints had disappeared entirely. By this time, it was approaching 7 p.m. and getting dark fast. Standard protocol would have been to mark our position, return to base, and resume the search with a full team in the morning. But something about the whole situation felt urgent. The way her camera had been positioned, the strange photos, the unnatural quiet in the forest, it all suggested that this wasn't a simple case of someone getting lost. I made the decision to continue for another hour, using our high-powered flashlights to follow what remained of the trail. It was a decision I've regretted every day for the past 9 years. The tracks led us to a small clearing about 6 miles from the main trail, a place I'd never seen despite years of working in that area. The clearing was maybe 30 yards across, surrounded by the largest trees I'd ever seen in the park. These weren't just big. They were ancient, easily 400 or 500 years old, with trunks so massive that it would take a dozen people holding hands to circle them. In the center of the clearing was a ring of stones, clearly man-made. Not a natural formation, but deliberately arranged, with gaps between each stone that seemed to align with the cardinal directions. The stones themselves were covered in moss and looked like they'd been there for decades, maybe longer. Janet aimed her flashlight at the stone circle. "What the hell is this?" None of us had an answer. In all my years at Olympic, I'd never seen anything like it. The park has some Native American historical sites, but this didn't match anything I'd learned about local tribal practices. It looked more like something from old European folklore, the kind of stone circle you might find in Ireland or Scotland. Marcus walked around the perimeter of the clearing, examining the ground with his flashlight. "No recent tracks," he called out. Whatever brought them here, they didn't stay long. That's when we heard the first voice. It came from the trees on the far side of the clearing, a child's voice calling out clearly in the still air, "Help me, please help me." All three of us froze. The voice was high and desperate, unmistakably that of a young person in distress, but it was coming from deep in the forest, from an area so thick with undergrowth that no one could have made it through without leaving a trail. "Delilah?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the clearing. No response. Just that unnatural silence settling back over everything. Janet started toward the source of the voice, but Marcus grabbed her arm. "Wait," he said quietly. "Something's not right about this." He was right. In all our years of search and rescue, we'd learned to trust our instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming that we needed to get out of that clearing. But we were rangers, and someone was calling for help. We couldn't just leave. I pulled out my radio to call for backup, but got only static. The radio had been working fine all day, but now I couldn't raise headquarters or any of the other search teams. Janet tried her radio with the same result. Nothing but white noise. "Equipment failure," Marcus said, but his voice was tight. "We should head back." Before I could respond, we heard the voice again, but this time it was coming from a completely different direction, from the trees to our left, maybe 40 yards away. Same voice, same desperate plea. "Help me. Please help me." And then, impossibly, we heard it again from behind us. The exact same words, in the exact same tone, as if someone was playing a recording from multiple hidden speakers throughout the forest. That's when I knew we were dealing with something far beyond a normal search and rescue operation. Janet was turning in circles, trying to locate the source of the voices. "This doesn't make sense," she kept saying. "This doesn't make sense." And Marcus had drawn his sidearm, though what good a pistol would do against disembodied voices I couldn't say. "We're leaving," he said firmly. "Now." But as we started to head back toward the trail, we heard something that made us all stop dead in our tracks. It was Delilah's voice, clear and unmistakable, calling from the darkness beyond the clearing. "Ranger Merrick? Is that you? I'm hurt. I can't move. Please help me." She knew my name. Somehow she knew my name. Against every instinct, against Marcus's protests, I followed the voice into the trees. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating massive trunks and hanging moss. But I couldn't see her anywhere. The voice kept calling, always just ahead, always just out of sight. "I'm here," she would say. "I'm right here. Why can't you see me?" I followed that voice deeper into the forest than I'd ever been, with Marcus and Janet reluctantly following behind me. The trees grew even larger, and the understory became so thick that we had to push through curtains of ferns and devil's club. My flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating more than a few feet ahead. And then I saw her. Delilah Crane was sitting at the base of an enormous cedar tree, maybe 100 yards from the stone circle. She was alive, conscious, and apparently uninjured, though her clothes were torn and muddy. She looked up at me with relief in her eyes as my flashlight beam found her. "Thank God," she said. "I've been lost for hours. My ankle. I think it's sprained." Everything about the scene should have been a relief. We'd found her. She was alive. The search was over. But something was wrong. Something was fundamentally, deeply wrong, though it took me a moment to realize what it was. She had no shadow. My flashlight was shining directly on her, bright enough to clearly illuminate her face and body, but there was no shadow cast on the tree behind her. It was as if the light was passing right through her. "Delilah?" I said carefully. "How do you know my name?" She smiled, and for just a moment something flickered in her expression. Something cold and predatory that didn't belong on a 16-year-old girl's face. "You're here to help me, aren't you, Ranger Merrick?" Behind me, I heard Janet gasp. When I looked back, she was pointing her flashlight at something in the trees beyond Delilah. There, barely visible in the shadows, stood the same tall figure we'd seen in the camera photos. But now I could see it clearly. It was a man, tall and gaunt, wearing military-style clothing and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He was standing perfectly still, watching us, and something about his posture suggested coiled violence, like a predator preparing to strike. When I looked back at Delilah, she was gone. Not missing, not hidden behind the tree. Gone. Vanished completely, as if she'd never been there at all. The man in the shadow stepped forward, and I could see his face in the flashlight beam. It was weathered and scarred, with pale eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. When he smiled, his teeth were too sharp, too white. "You're looking for the girl," he said, and his voice was wrong too deep, with an odd echo that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "She's safe. She's with me now." Marcus's training kicked in first. "Sir, I need you to identify yourself and step into the light where we can see you clearly." The man laughed, a sound like branches breaking. "I've been waiting for you, Rangers, especially you, Tobias. You're exactly what I've been looking for." He knew my name. Somehow this stranger in the forest knew my name. Janet had her radio out, desperately trying to raise headquarters, but all we could hear was static mixed with what sounded like whispered voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The radio seemed to be picking up something, but not from our base station. "Equipment's been unreliable out here lately," the man said conversationally. "Something about the electromagnetic field around these old trees plays havoc with modern technology." He took another step forward, and I could see that he was carrying military-grade equipment, night vision goggles hanging around his neck, a combat knife on his belt, what looked like a tactical vest under his jacket. This wasn't some lost hiker or harmless eccentric. This was someone with training, someone dangerous. "Where is Delilah Crane?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "She's learning," he said. "Learning about the old ways, the old spirits that live in these trees. Did you know this forest is older than your civilization? The Native Americans knew enough to be afraid of certain places. They had stories about trees that could think, about shadows that moved independently of their sources. Modern people have forgotten those stories." As he spoke, I became aware that the unnatural silence had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if the forest itself was listening, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus had positioned himself between the stranger and Janet, his hand resting on his weapon. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us for questioning regarding the disappearance of Delilah Crane." The man's smile widened. "I don't think so, Ranger. You see, you're in my territory now. These trees, this darkness, it's all mine. Has been for years. And now you're going to learn what the girl learned." That's when the voices started again, but this time they weren't calling for help. They were laughing. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, echoing through the forest from every direction. Children's laughter, adult laughter, the sound bouncing off the massive tree trunks until it became a cacophony that seemed to come from the darkness itself. Janet broke first. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush back toward the clearing. I wanted to follow her, but I couldn't leave Marcus alone with this man, and I still needed to know what had happened to Delilah. "Let her go," the man said, watching Janet's flashlight beam disappear through the trees. "She's not what I need. But you two, you have something special. Experience, training. You know these woods better than most. That makes you valuable." Marcus drew his weapon, a Glock 22 that looked small and inadequate in the vast darkness of the forest. "Hands where I can see them. Now." The man raised his hands, but he was still smiling. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't about weapons or training or any of the things they taught you. This is about something much older, much more fundamental." As he spoke, I noticed that our flashlight beams were growing dimmer, as if the batteries were dying. But I'd put fresh batteries in that morning, and the lights had been working fine all day. It was as if something was actively draining their power. "You feel it, don't you?" the man continued. "The way the forest changes at night, the way ordinary rules stop applying. Your friend felt it too before I took her." "Took her where?" I demanded. He gestured toward the darkness beyond the clearing. "Down, deep into the roots of the old trees, where the real forest lives. Where things that have been sleeping for centuries are finally waking up." Marcus fired. The shot was deafeningly loud in the still air, echoing off the tree trunks like thunder. But when our eyes adjusted after the muzzle flash, the man was gone. Not wounded, not down, simply vanished, as completely as Delilah had moments before. Where the hell did he go? Marcus spun in a circle, sweeping his flashlight beam through the trees. That's when we heard Delilah's voice again, but this time it was coming from directly above us. We looked up into the canopy, and there she was, sitting on a branch easily 40 feet off the ground, her legs dangling casually as if she were sitting on a park bench. "Up here?" she called down cheerfully. "The view is amazing from up here. You should come see." It was impossible. The tree she was sitting in had no lower branches. The trunk was smooth and straight for at least 60 feet before the first major limbs. There was no way she could have climbed up there. No way she could be sitting so casually at that height. Marcus aimed his flashlight up at her, and we could see her clearly. She looked normal, uninjured, even happy. But she was 40 feet up in a tree with no way to have gotten there. "Delilah," I called up to her. "We're here to help you. Can you get down?" She laughed, and it was the same laugh we'd been hearing from the darkness, multiplied and echoing. "I don't want to come down. It's beautiful up here. You can see everything, all the old paths through the forest, all the places people have died, all the bones buried under the moss." "This isn't real," Marcus said quietly. "None of this is real." But it was real. Whatever was happening in that forest, whatever that man had done or awakened, it was as real as the cold air and the darkness pressing in around us. Our flashlights were failing rapidly now, the beams growing dimmer by the minute. Soon we'd be in complete darkness, alone in the forest with whatever forces that man had unleashed. "We need to get back to the clearing," I said. "Find Janet, get out of here, call for backup." As we started to move, Delilah's voice followed us from above. "You can't leave, Ranger Merrick. You're part of it now. Part of the forest, part of the old stories." We made it back to the stone circle, but Janet wasn't there. Her flashlight was lying on the ground near one of the stones, still on but flickering weakly. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the clearing. She had simply vanished. Marcus picked up her flashlight and checked it. "Battery's almost dead," he said. "Same as ours." We had maybe 10 minutes of light left between all 3 flashlights. After that, we'd be stumbling through the forest in complete darkness, trying to find our way back to the main trail by memory and hope. "We have to try for the trailhead," I said. "Follow our own tracks back." But when we looked for the path we'd taken to reach the clearing, it wasn't there. The undergrowth showed no signs of our passage, no broken branches or disturbed ferns. It was as if we'd never entered the clearing at all, as if we'd simply materialized there. Marcus tried his radio one more time, and this time we got a response, but it wasn't from our headquarters. It was Janet's voice coming through the static. "Don't trust him. Don't trust anyone. He's not what he seems. He's been here for so long, and he's made friends with things that should have stayed buried." "Janet, where are you?" Marcus keyed the radio frantically. Her voice came back fainter, mixed with interference. "Under the trees. Under the roots. With the others. So many others. He's been collecting us for years." The radio went dead. Our flashlights gave out moments later, one by one, leaving us in absolute darkness. The kind of darkness that exists only in the deep forest, where no light penetrates and the blackness is so complete it feels solid, pressing against your eyes like velvet. But we weren't alone in that darkness. I could hear them moving around us, footsteps in the fallen leaves, branches rustling without any wind, whispered conversations in languages I couldn't understand. Sometimes I caught glimpses of shapes moving between the trees, pale figures that seemed to glow with their own faint light. "Stay close," Marcus whispered, and I could hear the fear in his voice. In 25 years as a ranger, he'd never encountered anything like this. We tried to move toward where we thought the trail might be, feeling our way from tree to tree using the massive trunks as landmarks. But the forest had changed. Trees that should have been there were gone, replaced by others in different configurations. The landscape itself seemed to be shifting around us. And then I heard my own voice calling from somewhere ahead. "Marcus? Tobias?" I found the way out. "Follow my voice." It was a perfect imitation of my voice, but I was standing right there. Something in the darkness was using my voice to try to lead Marcus away from me. "Don't listen," I whispered. "That's not me." But Marcus was already moving toward the voice, and I had to grab his arm to stop him. "Marcus, I'm right here. That's not me calling." He stopped, confused and disoriented. In the absolute darkness, with our senses compromised and our equipment failed, it was becoming impossible to trust anything we heard or felt. That's when the real Delilah Crane found us. She came stumbling out of the darkness, crying and terrified, her clothes torn and muddy. This wasn't the calm, impossible figure we'd seen before. This was a frightened 16-year-old girl who'd been lost in the forest for hours. "Thank God," she sobbed when she heard our voices. "I've been running all night. There's someone out there, someone hunting me. He's been chasing me through the trees, and I keep hearing voices of people who aren't there." This felt real in a way the earlier encounter hadn't. Her fear was genuine, her tears authentic. But after everything we'd experienced, how could we be sure? "Delilah," I said carefully, "tell me something only you would know. Something from your file." She looked at me with confusion and terror. "My file? I don't understand. I'm just trying to get out of here. That man, he's not normal. He can move through the forest without making any sound, and he knows things about me, about my family. He keeps talking about teaching me lessons about the old ways." It was her, the real Delilah Crane, not whatever illusion we'd encountered before. But that meant she'd been out here alone all night, hunted by that man while we'd been chasing shadows and voices. "Stay between us," Marcus told her. "We're getting you out of here." But as we started to move, the voices returned. Dozens of them now, calling from every direction. Men, women, children, all pleading for help, all claiming to be lost, all begging us to follow them to safety. The sound was overwhelming, a chorus of desperation that seemed to come from the trees themselves, and underneath it all, barely audible, was the man's laughter. He was toying with us, using the darkness and the impossible acoustics of the ancient forest to create a symphony of terror. Every voice we heard might be real, might be another victim he was holding somewhere in the depths of the woods. Or they might all be illusions, designed to drive us deeper into his territory. Delilah pressed close to me, shaking with fear. "He told me this forest was sacred to him," she whispered. "He said it had been waiting for someone like me, someone young and strong who could help him wake up the old spirits. I think he's been living out here for years and he's not entirely human anymore." As she spoke, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her breath wasn't visible in the cold air, even though Marcus's and mine showed clearly in the autumn chill. It was a small detail, but in our situation, every detail mattered. "Delilah," I said quietly, "how long have you been lost?" "Since this morning," she said. "I left the trail to photograph some of the bigger trees and then I couldn't find my way back. I've been wandering ever since." But that was impossible. We'd found her camera hours ago, positioned deliberately on that fallen log. If she'd been carrying it all day, how had it gotten there? I was about to question her further when Marcus grabbed my arm. "Listen," he hissed. In the distance, we could hear the sound of engines, ATVs or motorcycles moving through the forest. Search and rescue teams, most likely, looking for us after we'd failed to check in. The sound was coming from the direction of the main trail, maybe half a mile away. "This way," Marcus said, and we started moving toward the sound, using it as a beacon to guide us through the darkness. But as we walked, I noticed that Delilah wasn't making any sound. Marcus and I were crashing through the underbrush, snapping branches and rustling leaves with every step, but Delilah moved silently, as if her feet weren't quite touching the ground. The sound of the engines grew louder, and I could see lights flickering through the trees ahead. Real lights, not the pale glows we'd been seeing. Electric lights from real vehicles operated by real people. "Almost there," I told Delilah, but when I looked back, she was gone again. Marcus and I emerged from the forest onto the main trail just as a search team on ATVs reached our position. The lights were blinding after hours in the darkness, and it took several minutes for my eyes to adjust enough to recognize the team leader, Ranger Captain Sarah Mitchell, my supervisor. "Jesus Christ, Tobias," she said, climbing off her ATV. "Where the hell have you been? You missed your check-in 6 hours ago." 6 hours. It had felt like days since we'd entered that clearing, but according to my watch, it was just past midnight. We'd been lost in the forest for less than 3 hours. "We found evidence of the missing girl," Marcus reported, his voice steady despite everything we'd been through. "But we also encountered an individual who may be responsible for her disappearance. Armed and dangerous, possibly military training." Captain Mitchell radioed for additional units while the search team gave us water and energy bars. It wasn't until I was sitting on the back of an ATV drinking water and feeling the normalcy of organized rescue operations that I realized Janet wasn't with us. "Where's Kowalski?" Captain Mitchell asked. Marcus and I looked at each other. How could we explain what had happened to Janet? How could we describe the voices, the impossible sightings, the way the forest itself seemed to have turned against us? "She became separated from us in the darkness," I said finally. "We lost radio contact." It was the truth, just not the complete truth. The complete truth would have sounded like the ravings of people suffering from hypothermia and panic. We spent the rest of the night searching for Janet, using thermal imaging equipment and bringing in tracking dogs. We found her radio, her flashlight, and her ranger hat, all scattered in different locations throughout the forest. But we never found Janet herself. We also never found Delilah Crane. The search continued for 2 weeks, involving state police, FBI, and volunteer teams from across Washington. We combed every square mile of that section of the park, using helicopters, trained search dogs, and ground-penetrating radar. We investigated the stone circle I'd described, but when the search teams reached the coordinates I'd provided, there was nothing there, just ordinary forest, with no sign that a clearing had ever existed. The official report concluded that Janet Kowalski had suffered some kind of medical emergency that caused her to become disoriented and lost. Her body was never recovered, but the forest is vast and unforgiving. People disappear in the wilderness sometimes, and their remains are never found. Delilah Crane was classified as a missing persons case, still open but with no active leads. The theory was that she'd encountered a dangerous individual in the forest, possibly the same person who had caused Janet's disappearance. But without evidence, without a body, without any concrete leads, the case eventually went cold. I never mentioned the voices, the impossible sightings, or the man who seemed to vanish and reappear at will. Who would have believed me? Even I began to doubt my own memories as the weeks passed. The human mind is remarkably good at rationalizing the impossible, at finding logical explanations for events that defy logic. But I couldn't forget the feeling of that forest, the way it had felt alive and aware, hostile in a way that went beyond natural dangers. I couldn't forget the sound of my own voice calling from places I'd never been, or the sight of Delilah sitting impossibly high in that ancient tree. 3 months after the incident, I submitted my resignation from the National Park Service. I told my supervisors that I needed a change, that I wanted to try something different. I didn't tell them that I could no longer sleep through the night, that every shadow looked like it might contain something watching me, that the sound of wind through trees made my skin crawl. I moved to Nevada, about as far from the Olympic rainforest as I could get while staying in the continental United States. I found work with the Bureau of Land Management, managing desert preserves where the only trees are scattered, Joshua trees, and the visibility extends for miles in every direction. No dense canopies, no hidden clearings, no ancient forests where impossible things might happen. My wife thinks I have PTSD from finding Janet's equipment scattered through the forest, from failing to save either her or Delilah. She's probably right, though not for the reasons she thinks. I've been seeing a therapist for years, and he's helped me develop coping strategies for the nightmares, the anxiety, the persistent feeling that something is watching me from just outside my peripheral vision. But I still wake up at 3 in the morning, hearing voices calling from forests that are 1,000 miles away. I still can't look at photographs of dense woodland without feeling that familiar chill of absolute terror. And sometimes, when I'm working alone in the desert, I see footprints in the sand that don't belong to any of the local wildlife. Large prints with aggressive lug soles, the kind made by military-style boots. Last year, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photograph, a picture of the Olympic National Park taken from high above, showing the canopy of the ancient forest. But when I looked closely at the image with a magnifying glass, I could see something that made my hands shake. There, barely visible among the treetops, were tiny figures. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, sitting in the branches of the tallest trees like birds. And in the center of the image, standing in what looked like a clearing invisible from ground level, was a tall figure in military clothing, looking up at the camera, as if he knew exactly who would be viewing this photograph. On the back of the photo, written in handwriting I didn't recognize, was a single sentence: "The collection grows, and the old forest remembers." I burned the photograph immediately, but I can still see it clearly when I close my eyes. All those figures in the trees, all those missing persons who were never found, all of them part of whatever collection that man has been building in the depths of the Olympic forest. Sometimes I wonder if Janet and Delilah are up there too, sitting in the branches of ancient trees waiting for new visitors to guide deeper into the forest. Sometimes I wonder if I escaped that night, or if I'm still there, lost in the darkness between those massive trunks, following voices that lead nowhere. The thing that haunts me most isn't the supernatural elements, the impossible voices, the figures that appeared and vanished, the way the forest itself seemed to reshape around us. It's the human element, the man in military clothing who moved through that forest like he owned it, who had been collecting people for God knows how long, who used their voices and their forms to lure others deeper into his territory. Because that part was real. The equipment failures, the psychological manipulation, the way he used the dense forest and our own training against us. That was human intelligence applied with predatory precision. Whether the supernatural elements were real or just elaborate tricks designed to disorient and terrify us, I'll never know. But the man was real, and he's still out there. 3 weeks ago, I received a call from a detective in Washington State. They'd found human remains in a remote section of Olympic National Park, about 10 miles from where we'd encountered the stone circle. skeletal remains of at least 6 individuals, buried in a pattern that suggested ritual placement. The bones showed signs of prolonged captivity, healed fractures that indicated restraints, stress markers that suggested extended periods of malnutrition and fear. They couldn't identify most of the remains. Some had been there for years, possibly decades. But one set of bones belonged to a hiker who disappeared in 2003, another to a camper from 2008. All missing persons cases that had gone cold, all people who'd vanished without a trace in the Olympic forest. We think we're dealing with a serial killer who's been operating in the park for at least 15 years, the detective told me. Someone with extensive survival training who knows the terrain well enough to avoid detection. We're reopening several missing persons cases, including Janet Kowalski and Delilah Crane. They wanted me to return to Washington to help them search the areas where we'd lost contact with Janet and encountered the mysterious man. They wanted me to relive that night, to walk back into that forest and try to remember details that might help them catch a killer. I told them I'd think about it, but I won't go back. Not ever. Because I know something the detective doesn't know, something I could never put in an official report or testimony. That forest isn't just hiding a human predator, it's hiding something much older, much more dangerous. The man we encountered wasn't just a serial killer using the wilderness to conceal his crimes. He was something else, something that had made a pact with forces that exist in the deep places of the ancient world. The way he moved without sound, the way he seemed to know things he couldn't possibly know, the way the forest itself responded to his presence. That wasn't just advanced training or psychological manipulation. That was something that exists at the intersection of human evil and supernatural malevolence. And the voices we heard, the impossible sightings, the way technology failed around him, those weren't tricks or hallucinations brought on by stress and fear. They were real manifestations of something that has been sleeping in those ancient trees for centuries, something that human intrusion had awakened and fed. The Olympic forest is over 12 million acres of some of the oldest continuous forest ecosystem in North America. Trees that were already giants when the first European explorers reached the Pacific coast. Ecosystems that have been undisturbed for millennia, except by the indigenous peoples who knew enough to treat certain areas with reverence and fear. In research I've done since that night, research I probably shouldn't have done, reading books I probably shouldn't have read, I've learned that many cultures have stories about forests that become aware, trees that develop consciousness over centuries of existence. The Celtic Druids spoke of groves where the boundary between the natural and supernatural became thin. Native American traditions include numerous warnings about places where the spirits of the land become corrupted, where human evil can awaken ancient hungers. The man we encountered wasn't just living in that forest. He was serving it, feeding it, helping it grow stronger by bringing it fresh victims. And in return, it was granting him abilities that no human should possess. The power to move unseen, to manipulate perception, to use the voices and forms of his victims to lure new prey. That's why I can't go back. That's why I wake up every night at 3 a.m., not just from nightmares, but from the absolute certainty that something is still calling to me from those ancient trees. Something that knows my name, knows where I live, knows that I escaped when I should have become part of its collection. My wife found me last week standing in our backyard at 3 a.m, staring west toward Washington State. I don't remember getting out of bed, don't remember walking outside, but I was standing there in my pajamas listening to voices that were coming from over 1,000 miles away. The forest remembers, they were saying. The forest remembers, and the collection must be completed. I've started making preparations, not to return to Washington, I'll never do that, but to go further away, maybe to another country entirely, somewhere with no ancient forests, no deep woodlands, no places where human evil might find supernatural allies. Because I'm beginning to understand that what happened that October night in 2016 wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The man in the military clothing, the collector of lost souls, didn't just let me escape. He released me, the way a cat releases a mouse it's been playing with. Not out of mercy, but because the hunt is more interesting when the prey has hope. And now, after 9 years of running, after 9 years of trying to forget, I think he's ready to finish what he started. The voices are getting stronger. The dreams are becoming more vivid, and sometimes, when I look out at the Nevada desert where nothing should be able to hide, I see footprints in the sand that don't belong to any local wildlife. Large prints, military-style boots, getting closer every night. If you're reading this account, if someone finds this testimony after I disappear, remember this. The Olympic National Park contains dangers that exist beyond any official warnings or safety guidelines. There are places in that forest where human evil has awakened something ancient and hungry, something that uses our own voices and faces against us. Stay on the marked trails. Travel in groups. Carry backup communication equipment, and if you encounter a tall man in military clothing who knows more about you than he should, who moves through the forest without making a sound, who offers to help you find someone you've lost, run. Run as far and as fast as you can, and don't stop running until you reach a place where no trees grow and the sky stretches endlessly overhead. Because once the forest remembers your name, once you become part of the collection, there's nowhere in the world far enough to hide. It's 3:17 a.m. as I finish writing this. I can hear them calling again, closer now than they've ever been before. Delilah's voice, Janet's voice, and dozens of others I don't recognize. All of them asking me to come home, to return to the forest where I belong. And underneath it all, barely audible but unmistakable, is the sound of military boots walking across desert sand, getting closer with each step. The collection must be completed, and I think my time is finally up.